I gotta make this quick. This is gonna be, I'm just gonna read it from my blog, Catch On. For posterity's sake, Henry David Thoreau. Pro slavery Christian fascism. 3. Going into this, part 3, remember or realize this man's fortunes were gained by functioning as one of the most prominent and influential pro slavery propagandists. In fact, he is still held by modern U.S. Christian fascists as a good man, owing many of the current pro-war, anti-Muslim, anti-gay, anti-children, and anti-humanism traditions to the template and ideals manifested in this fascist monster's work. It doesn't take intellect as much as guts to face the role his descendants have played on sustaining the glorious imaginary character of their like-minded son of a bitch ass fuck of a father he was, and raised as a son who in turn raised a like artificial intelligence drone of a fascist dread, not only carrying on the decrepit legacy of filth and turpitude of treasonous social Darwinism, but preserving his name in suggested stations of honor. Nothing more than Nazi-like front organizations regurgitating the very sociopathic insanity that is their family and social circles, specifically Columbia Broadcasting System. Columbia, owing to the genocidal, brute, rampant rape conquest of the dignified human social units that embraced, clothed, and fed the colonial Christians who raised their children to massacre as many women, children, elderly, and men as they could catch for over 500 years. This is the legacy of CBS, held sacred, worshipped as the god of its employees, regardless of race and gender, each individual representing the epitome of the most disgusting element of all humanity, the sellout, an army of Judases who, just to render unto Caesar before to their neighbors, sell their entire existence, offspring and all, for promissory notes good for the recovery of their malfeasance unto nothing but destruction of the species as a single family. With that, this is the true American fascism Christianity, stripped of all its glitz and loyalty, exposed as greedy, self-serving legions of demons, parasitically thriving off the backs of people they just have to hate to be Christian. This is what brought on the duty of civil disobedience from Henry David Thoreau's heart. See the contrast of the effects throughout the time. See the fruits each bore, and be the judge. On the duty of submission to civil government, William Paley, Book 5, Chapter 3, The Duty of Submission to Civil Government, explained. The subject of this chapter is sufficiently distinguished from the subject of the last, as the motives which actually produce civil obedience may be and often are very different from the reasons which make that obedience a duty. In order to prove civil obedience to be a moral duty and an obligation unto the conscience, it hath been usual that many political writers, at the head of whom we find the most venerable name of Locke, to state a compact between the citizen and the state as the ground and cause of the relationship between them, which compact, binding the parties for the same general reason the private contracts do, resolve the duty of submission to civil government into the universal obligation of fidelity in the performance of promises. This compact is twofold. First, an express compact by the primitive founders of the state, who are supposed to have convened for the declared purpose of settling the terms of their political union and a future constitution of government. The whole body is supposed, in the first place, to have unanimously consented to be bound by the resolutions of the majority. That majority, in the next place, to have fixed certain fundamental regulations, and then to have constituted, either in one person or in an assembly, the rule of succession or appointment, being at the same time determined. A standing legislature, to whom, under these pre-established restrictions, the government of the state was thenceforward committed, and whose laws that several members of the convention were, by their first undertaking, thus personally engaged to obey. This transaction is sometimes called the social compact, and thus suppose original regulations composed what are meant by the Constitution, the fundamental laws of the Constitution, and form on one side the inherent indefensible prerogative of the Crown, and on the other the unalienable, imprescriptible birthright of the subject. Secondly, a tacit or implied compact by the succeeding members of the states, who by accepting its protection consent to be bound by its laws. In like manner as whoever voluntarily enters into a private society is understood without any other or more explicit stipulations to promise a conformity with the rules and obedience to the government of that society as the known conditions upon which he is admitted to a participation of its privileges. This account of the subject, although specious, and patronized by names the most respectable, appears to labor under the following objections: that it is founded upon the supposition false in fact, and leading to a dangerous conclusion. No social compact similar to what is here described was ever made or entered into in reality. No such original convention of the people was ever actually holden, or in any country could be holden. Antecedent to the existence of civil government in that country. It is supposed it possible to call savages out of caves and desert to deliberate and vote upon topics which the experience and studies and refinements of civil life alone suggest. Therefore, no government in the universe began from this original. Some imitation of a social compact may be taken place at a revolution. The present age has been witness to a transaction which bears the nearest resemblance to this political idea, of any of which history has preserved the account or memory. I refer to the establishment of the United States of North America. We saw the people assemble to elect deputies for the avowed purpose of framing the constitution of a new empire. We saw this deputation of the people deliberately and resolving upon a form of government, erecting a permanent legislature, distributing the functions of sovereignty, establishing and promulgating a code of fundamental ordinances which were to be considered by succeeding generations not merely as laws and acts of the state, but as the very terms and conditions of this confederation, and binding not only upon the subjects and magistrates of the state, but as limitations of power which were to control and regulate the future legislature. Yet even here much was presupposed. In settling the Constitution, many important parts were presumed to be already settled. The qualifications of the constituents who were admitted to vote in the election of members of Congress, as well as the mode of electing the representatives, were taken from the old forms of government, that was wanting, from which every social union should set off, and which alone makes the resolution of the society the act of the individual, the unconstrained consent of all to be bound by the decision of the majority. And yet without this previous consent, the revolt and the regulations which followed it were compulsory upon dissidents. But the original compact, we are told, is not proposed as a fact, but as a fiction, which furnishes a commodious explication of the mutual rights and duties of sovereigns and subjects. In answer to this representation of the matter, we observe that the original compact, if it be not a fact, is nothing, can confer no actual authority upon laws or magistrates, nor afford any foundation to rights which are supposed to be real and existing. But the truth is that in the books and in the apprehension of those who deduce our civil rights and obligations, a pact is, I think it's a Latin word actually, I got this messed up in the transfer. The original convention is appealed to and treated as a reality. Whether the disciples of the system speak of the Constitution, of the fundamental articles of the Constitution, of laws being constitutional or unconstitutional, of inherent, unalienable, inextinguishable rights, either in the prince or in the people, or indeed of any laws, usages, or civil rights, as transcending the authority of the subsisting legislator, or possessing a force and sanction superior to what belong to the modern acts and edicts of the legislature. They secretly refer us to what passed at the original convention. They would teach us to believe that certain rules and ordinances were established by the people at the same time that they settled the charter of the government, and that the powers as well as the form of the future legislature, that is, legislature consequently deriving its commission and existence from the consent and act of the primary assembly, of which indeed it is only the standing deputation, continues subject in the exercise of its offices and as to the extent of its power to the rules, reservations, and limitations which the same assembly then made and prescribed to it. Quote, as the first members of the state were bound by express stipulation to obey the government which they had erected, so the succeeding inhabitants of the same country are understood to promise allegiance to the constitution and government they find established by accepting its protection, claiming its privileges, and acquiescing in its laws, more especially by the purchase or inheritance of lands to the possession of which allegiance to the state is annexed as the very service and condition of the tenure. Close quote. Smoothly as this train of argument proceeds, little of it will endure examination. The native subjects of modern states are not conscious of any stipulations which the sovereigns of ever exercising an election, whether they will be bound or not by the acts of the legislature, or of any alternative being proposed to their choice, of a promise either required or given, nor do they apprehend that the validity or authority of the law depends at all upon their recognition or consent. In all stipulations, whether they be expressed or implied, private or public, formal or constructive, the party stipulating must both possess the liberty of assent and refusal, and also be conscious of this liberty, which cannot with truth be affirmed of the subjects of civil government as government is now or ever was actually administered. This is a defect which no argument can excuse or supply. All presumptions of consent without this consciousness or in opposition to it are vain and erroneous. Still less is it possible to reconcile with any idea of stipulation the practice in which all European nations agree of founding allegiance upon the circumstances of nativity, that is, of claiming and treating as subjects all those who are born within the confines of their domains, although removed to another country in their youth or infancy. In this instance, certainly the state does not presume a compact. Also, if the subject be bound only by his own consent, and if the voluntary abiding in the country be the proof and intimation of that consent, by what arguments we should defend the right which sovereigns universally assume of prohibiting, when they please, the departure of their subjects out of the realm. Again, when it is contended that the taking and holding possession of lands amounts to an acknowledgment of the sovereign and a virtual promise of allegiance to his laws, it is necessary to the validity of the argument to prove that the inhabitants who first composed and constituted the state collectively possessed a right to the soil of the country, a right to parcel it out to whom they pleased, and to annex to the donation what conditions they thought fit. How came they by this right? An agreement amongst themselves would not confer it. That could only adjust what would already belong to them. A society of men vote themselves to be the owners of a region of the world. Does that vote unaccompanied, especially with any culture, enclosure, or proper act of occupation, make it theirs? Does it entitle them to exclude others from it, or to dictate the conditions upon which it shall be enjoyed? Yet this original collective right and ownership is the foundation for all the reasoning by which the duty of allegiance is inferred from the possession of land. The theory of government which affirms the existence and the obligation of the social compact would, after all, merit little discussion, and however groundless and unnecessary, should receive no opposition from us. Did it not appear to lead to conclusions unfavorable to the improvement and to the peace of human society? First, upon the supposition that government was first erected by, and that it derives all its just authority from, resolutions entered into by a convention of people, it is capable of being presumed that many points were settled by the convention, anterior to the establishment of the substituting legislature, and which the legislature consequently has no right to alter or interfere with. These points are called the fundamentals of the Constitution, as it is impossible to determine how many or what they are. The suggesting of any such serves extremely to embarrass the deliberations of the legislature, and afford a dangerous pretense for disputing the authority of the laws. It was this sort of reasoning, so far as reasoning of any kind was employed in the question, that produced in this nation the doubt which so much agitated the minds of men in the reign of the second Charles, whether an act of parliament could of right alter or limit the succession of the crown. Secondly, if it be by virtue of a compact that the subject owes obedience to civil government, it will follow that he ought to abide by the form of government which he finds established, be it ever so absurd or inconvenient. He is bound by his bargain. It is not permitted to any man to retreat from his engagement merely because he finds the performance disadvantageous or because he has the opportunity of entering into a better. This law of contracts is universal, and to call the relation between the sovereign and the subject a contract, yet not to apply to it the rules or allow of the effects of a contract, is an arbitrary use of names and an unsteadiness in reasoning which can teach nothing. Resistance to the encroachment of the supreme magistrate may be justified upon this principle. Recourse to arms for the purpose of bringing about an amendment of the Constitution can never can. No form of government contains a provision for its own dissolution, and few governments will consent to the extinction or even to any abridgment of their own power. It does not therefore appear how despotic governments can ever, in consistency with the obligation of the subject, be changed or mitigated. Despotism is the constitution of many states, and whilst a despotic prince exacts from his subjects the most rigorous servitude, according to this account, he is only holding them to their agreement. A people may vindicate by force the rights which the Constitution has left them, but every attempt to narrow the prerogative of the crown by new limitations and in opposition to the will of the reigning prince, whatever opportunities may invite or success follow, must be condemned as an infraction of the compact between the sovereign and the subject. Thirdly, every violation of the compact on the part of the governor releases the subject from his allegiance and dissolves the government. I do not perceive how we can avoid this consequence. If we found the duty of allegiance upon contract and confess any analogy between the social compact and other contracts, in private contracts, the violation and non-performance of the conditions by one of the parties vacates the obligation of the other. Now, the terms and articles of the social compact being nowhere extant or expressed, the rights and offices of the administrator of an empire being so many and various, the imaginary and convorted line of his prerogative being so liable to be overstepped in one part or the other, the position that every such transgression amounts to a forfeiture of the government and consequently authorizes the people to withdraw their obedience and provide for themselves by a new settlement, would endanger the stability of every political fabric in the world, and has in fact always supplied the disaffected with a topic of sedition declamation. If occasions have arisen in which the plea had been resorted to with justice and success, they have been occasions in which revolution was defensible upon others and plainer principle. The plea itself is at all times captious and unsafe. Wherefore, rejecting the intervention of the compact as unfounded in its principle and dangerous in the application, we assign the only grounds that the subject's obligation, the will of God as collected from expediency. The step by which the argument proceeds are few and direct. It is the will of, quote, it is the will of God that the happiness of human life be promoted, close quote. This is the first step in the foundation, not only of this, but of every moral conclusion. Quote, civil society conduces to that end, close quote. His is the second proposition. Quote, civil society cannot be upholden unless in each the interest of the whole society be binding upon every part of the member of it, close quote. His is the third step, and conducts us to conclude, namely, quote, that so long as the interest of the whole society requires it, that is, so long as the established government cannot be resisted or changed without public inconveniency, it is the will of God which will universally determine our duty that the established government be obeyed and no longer. The principles being admitted, the justice of every particular case of resistance is reduced to a computation of the quality of the danger and the grievance on the other side, and the probability of expense of redressing it on the other. But who shall judge this? We answer, quote, every man for himself, close quote. In contentions between the sovereign and the subject, the parties acknowledge no common arbitrator, and it would be absurd to refer the decision to those whose conduct provoke the question, and whose own interest, authority, and fate are immediately concerned in it. The danger of error and abuse is no objection to the rule of expediency, because every other rule is liable to the same or greater, and every rule that can be propounded upon the subject, like all rules indeed which appeal to or bind the conscience, must in the application depend upon private judgment. It may be observed, however, that it ought equally to be accounted the exercise of a man's own private judgment, whether he be determined by reasoning or conclusion of his own, or submit to be directed by the advice of others, provide he be free to choose his guide. We proceed to point out some easy but important inferences which result from the substitution of public expediency into the place of all implied compacts, promises, and conventions whatsoever. 1. It may be as much a duty at one time to resist government as it is another to obey it, to wit, whenever more advantage will, in our opinion, occur to the community from resistance than mischief. 2. The lawfulness of resistance or the lawfulness of revolt does not depend alone upon the grievances which is substantiated or feared, but also upon the probable expense and event of the contest. They were concerted. The revolution in English were justified in their counsel, because from the apparent disposition of the nation and the strength and the charter of the parties engaged, the measure was likely to be brought about with little mischief or bloodshed, whereas it might have been a question with many friends of their country whether the injuries then endured and threatened would have authorized the renewal of a doubtful civil war. 3. Irregularly in her first foundation of a test, or of a subsequent violence, fraud, or injustice in getting possession of the supreme power, are not sufficient reasons for resistance. After the government is once peaceably settled, no subject of the British Empire conceives himself engaged to vindicate the justice of the Norman claim of conquest, or apprehends that his duty in any manner depends upon that controversy. So, likewise, in the latter house of Lancaster, or even the posterity of Cromwell, had been at this day seated upon the throne of England, we should have been as little concerned to inquire how the founder of the family came there. No civil contest is so futile, although none have been so furious and sanguinary, as those which are excited by a disputed succession. 4. Not every invasion of the subject's rights or liberty, or of the Constitution, not every breach of promise or of oath, not every stretch of prerogative, abuse of power, or neglect of duty by the chief magistrate or by the whole of any branch of the legislature body justifies resistance, unless these crimes draw after the public consequences of sufficient magnitude to outweigh the evils of civil disturbance. Nevertheless, every violation of the Constitution ought to be watched with jealousy and resented as such, beyond what the quality of estimable damage would require to warrant, because a known and settled usage of governing affords the only security against the enormities of uncontrolled dominion, and because this security is weakened by every encroachment which is made without opposition or opposed without effect. 5. No usage, law, or authority whatsoever is so binding that it need or ought to be continued when it may be changed with advantage to the community, the family of the prince, the order of succession, the prerogative of the crown, the form and parts of the legislature, together with the respective powers, office, duration, and mutual dependency of the several parts, are all only so many laws, mutable like other laws, whenever expediency requires, either by the ordinary act of the legislature, or, if the occasion deserves it, by the interposition of the people. These points are wont to be approached with a kind of awe. They are represented to the mind as principles of the Constitution settled by our ancestors, and being settled, to be no more committed to innovation or debate, as foundation never to be stirred, as the terms and conditions of the social compact to which every citizen of the state has engaged his fidelity by virtue of a promise which he cannot now recall. Such reasons have no place in our system. To us, if there be any good reason for treating these with more deference and respect than other laws, it is either the advantage of the present constitution of government, which reason must be of different force in different countries, or because in all countries it is the importance and acknowledged and understood as well by the governors as the governed, and because the seldomer it is changed, the more perfectly it will be known on both sides. I'm going to have to stop there. And it's such a shame because I only have a couple more points. I'm going to do a continuation.